Hi everyone. A few people have suggested videos by Rationality Rules as ones I might have something to say about, specifically videos in which the YouTuber Stephen Woodford delves into sex and gender. This is apparently a departure from his usual fare. In his channel description, he promises to debunk and refute predominantly religious and supernatural arguments. Okay, so maybe not so much of a departure, as many recognise gender ideology as being somewhat akin to a religion, given the faith required to buy into it. So I'm sure Stephen will supply a very competent and thorough debunking, right? The video I'm going to comment on is entitled, "Are Women Only Adult Females?" And it features the self-described renegade science teacher, aka Forrest Valkai, who is wrongly regarded by many people as some kind of authority, even though he doesn't appear to have published a single peer-reviewed science paper or even articles. If I'm wrong, please let me know, giving the titles and where they're published. Now, so far as I can see, Rationality Rules has made 3 videos recently about sex and gender, and I am responding to the second one. The first one I decided not to bother with. I didn't even watch it after seeing how he promoted it on Twitter and seeing the responses. I think referring to anything Richard Dawkins has said recently as anti-trans statements is ridiculous. So I decided to take the word of people whose judgment I trust on it. The third and most recent video is entitled "The Science of Sex and Gender," and my first thought was to switch to reacting to that one instead, but my second thought was, stuff that, it's 2 hours long and it seems to be a discussion between Stephen and Forrest Valkai, whose judgment I don't trust at all. In any case, it was this second video that people had asked me to respond to, and given that somebody had also asked me to talk about androgen insensitivity syndrome, and that video of Rationality Rules focuses quite a lot on that particular condition, it's a chance to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, although I won't be talking about that syndrome until part 2 of this reaction. I'm going to again do this in 2 parts because I've got quite a lot to say and I don't like talking for too long. Now, you may have got a hint from the title of the Rationality Rules video, "Are Women Only Adult Females?" that it is yet another deployment of the intersex gambit, meaning that the existence of people with differences of sex development are deployed for the ultimate purpose of claiming that trans women are women and trans men are men. Stephen is pretty open about this.
Now, while this series relates to trans people, the point of this specific episode actually has little to do with trans people. You see, in order to convince someone that, say, a trans woman is a woman, you're first going to need to convince them that a male, that is, someone who typically has small gametes, sperm and XY chromosomes, can be a woman, and vice versa. If you can do this, then you'll be more than halfway to convincing them on the trans argument, right? I mean, put it this way, once one makes room for some males being women, they're going to have to do some work to explain why trans women don't meet the criteria, which is going to move the conversation into fresher waters. In effect, if you convince someone that some males can be women, you will have kicked down the door, or more accurately, rebutted the central premise in their position. And this is the goal for this video.
Great, let's go there. Though it seems Stephen isn't going to explain why he thinks trans women are women in this video, and he'll do that in a later one. In this video that I'm reacting to, he's just using the intersex gambit to try to kick down the door. A bit like this British schoolboy did injuring a girl who was using a school toilet that had been made unisex thanks to the ideology that Stephen and Forrest are apparently enthralled to. Just saying. Okay, let's jump in.
I think it's obvious that sex and gender are not the same thing. Sex is biological, whereas gender is a social construct, and I prefer to reserve the words male and female for sex and man and woman for gender.
Oops, sorry to cut you short, Stephen. So he's taking words that have long established and globally accepted usage as the colloquial terms for adult human males and females, and apparently redefining them to refer to this thing called gender, which, he says, is obviously different from sex. Right, in an attempt to maximise clarity, I'm not going to go through the video reacting to everything that is said or even in the order it is said in. In this first part, I'm going to focus on a little bit of what is said about sex, not about DSDs and not about gender either, in order to give the gist of the run-up to the main argument being made, which I'll show in part 2.
Sex, per my view, is binary. And as of this time, no, you can't change your sex.
Oh, good. He's saying sex is binary. He spends a bit of time talking about DSDs. I won't show it, but at least he's not making that idiotic claim that gender ideologues so often make, that because there are non-standard karyotypes and variations in sex development, that sex is a spectrum.
To be clear, there are other definitions of sex on the table that do not entail sex being binary. And my guest today throughout this video, Forrest Valkai, is an example of a biologist, no less, that holds such a view.
A biologist, no less. Okay, time to return to that Twitter exchange. Someone whose account no longer exists apparently challenged the description of Forrest as a biologist. Then Forrest appears and says, "I have multiple degrees and years of experience in biology that allowed me to build my career as a science communicator and social media influencer." Yeah, that's the trouble with social media influencers. They are free to talk nonsense and influence people who don't know very much without being accountable to anyone but themselves. Biological sex is determined by several factors, not one of which has only two options. Greater than 2 does not equal 2. Sex isn't binary. Soon afterwards, Emma Hilton, who is actually a biologist no less, arrives. I won't show the whole of their exchange, but eventually Emma cuts to the chase and says, "How many sexes are there?" And Forrest replies, "Most of us would say 2 out of hand, but we've learnt a lot since we decided on that number. The closer we look at the lines, the blurrier they become, blah, blah, pathways, blah, blah, permutations. Sex is a spectrum." What spectrum? What is the defining parameter? Oh my God, is he seriously trying to say that sex is a spectrum? Yeah, that was a clip from the video I did reacting to Forrest. This is a terrible misuse of the word spectrum, but Emma's response is more pertinent here. She asks him, why did we decide on that number? Yeah, why did we decide there are 2 sexes? The fact that he is saying we decided this, well, words fail me. He responds, "The same reason we used to think sex was the same thing as gender, or that homosexuality was a mental illness, or that left-handedness was a disorder. The people who established the science were trapped in the heuristics of their culture and assumed everything else was a mistake." What? That's an incredible response from someone who is supposedly a biologist and whom I've heard, though I've never actually watched him, knows a lot of stuff about evolution. He's basically saying we decided there are 2 sexes because of cultural ignorance, completely ignoring the evolved function of sex. I'll just let Emma finish. That really doesn't answer my question, why did we not decide on 3 or 4? And answer came there none, at least not from Forrest. There was, of course, much jeering at his silence from others in those shark-infested waters of Twitter. Another source, which I posted below the video I did in response to Forrest, and will do the same here, is this paper by biologists no less, which gives a clear explanation as to why just 2 sexes evolved. It was no more of a decision we made than the evolution of anything else is. Not a single peer-reviewed biology paper describes sex as a spectrum, or as bimodal for that matter. What Forrest is trying to do is persuade people that we should categorize sex on some other grounds rather than on its evolved function of reproduction, as real biologists do. I mean, the ones that haven't been captured by the gender lunacy. That function is the answer to why we have sex bodies, why there evolved no more than or less than 2 gametes, what would be the purpose of categorizing it according to some other criteria than how we reproduce? The answer to that question lies not in science, but in ideology. If you're asked to define, say, an ear, you would say what its function is. That's probably the first thing you'd say, because there is no ideological reason to forget to mention it, regardless of the fact that it doesn't function properly in everyone. The fact that some people have differences of sex development, sometimes ambiguous sex characteristics, sometimes they end up with the phenotype, the external appearance, including genitals, of the other sex rather than the one indicated by their sex chromosomes. Ideologues use these conditions to suggest there is a spectrum, that male and female categories are mere social constructs, arbitrary groupings, that there are varying degrees of maleness and femaleness, and that sex categories are just not that important. And it follows that we should all be free to choose what we identify as, and everybody else should respect that identity. Otherwise, they're transphobes and bigots and Nazis, etc., etc. Now, several minutes of the Rationality Rules video is taken up with Stephen asking Forrest questions and Forrest talking about various DSDs in support of his argument that sex is a spectrum. Irrelevant, so I won't show it, but I will show some of what was said before that.
So let's start at the very beginning. What was our ancestors' understanding of sex? What was their views?
So there's a lot that we do and don't know. It's very likely that their concept of sex would have just been totally limited to their external phenotype, just whatever they could see with their eyes. Your phenotype is what your body actually is. It is your outward presentation. Now, when we talk about phenotype in terms of sex determination in early civilizations, they're obviously not cutting anybody open to see what plumbing they have before they address them as a person. They're probably just looking on the surface level.
Is Forrest being disingenuous here? The question was, what was our ancestors' understanding of sex? Not how did our ancestors tell the two sexes apart? What sex is, how it is defined, what is its purpose, those are very different questions from how do we recognize the sex of any living organism. And by the way, given the prevalence of sexual reproduction in complex life forms, for him to be talking about human beings as if we are the only species in existence is peculiar for a biologist, no less. And, of course, you don't have to be a biologist to know that in some animals it is not that easy to tell male from female at a glance. To say that our ancestors' concept of sex, which was his phrase, would have been limited to their phenotype, their external appearance, doesn't actually make sense. What would at least make some kind of sense, so it would be untrue, would be an answer like, our ancestors had no idea what sex was, what its purpose was. They only recognise that there are 2 categories of people based on their genitals and secondary sex characteristics. That is quite a common conflation. In fact, Andy Lewis, whose Quackometer blog is one of the most highly respected skeptic blogs, once wrote a blog post about, well, it was having a go at someone else who was making the same error. And they did it in an article published in The Skeptic magazine, no less. Andy's post is called On the Ontology and Epistemology of Sex. Ontology is about what something is, what its nature is, right? What is a sex? How many sexes are there, and how do we characterize a sex? Those are ontological questions. How do we recognize the sex of an individual? What features indicate sex is an epistemological question. We can't answer how we recognize whether any organism is male or female unless we know why males and females evolved. And obviously Forrest does know, but he avoids referring to it. It's like saying our ancestors' concept of an ear was limited to knowing that it stuck on the side of one's head. I'm going to quote a whole passage from Andy's blog because it really hits the nail on the head. The purpose of such arguments presented here in the Skeptic magazine is for us to be convinced that sex is arbitrary and not objectively knowable, and to abandon objective attempts to define terms like male and female, man and woman. It is a textbook example of postmodernist denialism of science, reason and objectivity, using sleight of hand to undermine understanding. Such arguments are now so common and fashionable, even among those educated in medicine and biology, that recently the Endocrine Society in the US felt it needed to publish a position statement on the fact that sex is real, binary and immutable, and that recording sex accurately was vital in healthcare and research, as we should not conflate sex and gender. I'll say something about conflating sex and gender, which is a phrase Stephen uses repeatedly throughout his video, next time. In the meantime, I guarantee that our ancestors had worked out that sex is how we reproduce, and it takes precisely one male and one female. Now, let's hear from Stephen.
So that's the beginning sorted. For nearly all of human history, sex has been categorized based on observable traits, phenotype alone. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And no, reproduction was not a necessary condition. The Virgin Queen never had children, and yet she was still recognized as a queen, a female monarch.
So he's basically repeating what Forrest says, and he apparently thinks Elizabeth I usefully illustrates the claim because, based on external appearance, there would have been no question in anyone's mind that she was female and most probably able to produce an heir had she chosen to marry. I can see where he's going with this, and we'll see how he gets there in part 2. One more thing before I finish, though, is that, as we've heard, Stephen says that he sees sex as binary. Doesn't he? Not anymore. Apparently, not long after he published this video, he pinned this comment below it. To those who have said that it's more accurate to say that my view of sex is bimodal, not binary, you're absolutely correct. Cheers for the pointer. Now, I saw quite a few commenters point out that it makes no sense to view sex as a bimodal distribution, but by the time I took the screenshot 2 weeks later, it had been liked 373 times. That's a lot of ignorance about what a bimodal distribution is. I know I explained it before in the video I did debunking Vosh, so I won't go there again. The Paradox Institute made a short video about this nonsense, and here is a still from it. I'll leave you with the obvious question. If you think sex is bimodal, what exactly is on the x-axis? That's the line along the bottom of the picture. Till next time, bye for now.